Imagine this. It's the morning of March 4th, 2023. A young woman in Colleran Township, Ohio, is supposed to be preparing for the happiest day of her life. She's 26 years old, glowing, and ready to welcome her first child. Her family has been counting down the days, the crib is waiting, the baby clothes are folded, and excitement is in the air. This is the day she's supposed to give birth. But instead of joy, what happens inside that small apartment is pure horror. When police arrive, they find a scene no one can ever forget. The mother-to-be is gone. Her unborn baby, who should have been taking his very first breath, never gets the chance. It is brutal. It is cold. And it is something investigators would later call one of the most heartbreaking crimes they had ever seen. The victim's name was India Kinamore. She wasn't just another headline. She was a daughter, a friend, and a young mother whose life was cut short in the cruelest way imaginable. And here's the part that shakes everyone to the core. The violence didn't come from a stranger breaking into her home. It wasn't the result of random street crime. No, what happened that day was orchestrated by someone she trusted the most. Someone who should have been by her side in the hospital, holding her hand, meeting their newborn together. Instead, that person allegedly plotted her death. What kind of desperation or darkness could drive someone to do that? How does a father-to-be transform into the mastermind of a murder, targeting not only the mother of his child, but also the baby she was carrying? This story isn't just about a tragic killing. It's about betrayal, manipulation, and a shocking plan carried out with chilling precision. Over the next few segments, we're going to take you deep into the life of India Kinamore, the circumstances leading up to her final day, and the disturbing investigation that revealed a truth almost too hard to believe. We'll uncover the strained relationship with her partner, the financial pressures, the secret preparations he made, even filing for bereavement leave before she was gone. And we'll explore how detectives pieced it all together, step by step, until justice finally caught up with those responsible. But before we get into the investigation, before we talk about the suspects, and before we hear the chilling courtroom details, let's pause for a moment. Because at the center of this case is a young woman who should still be alive today, raising her son. Her story deserves to be told, and it deserves to be remembered. This is the case of India Kinamore, murdered on the very day she was supposed to bring new life into the world. Before we dive into the crime itself, it's important to pause and understand who India Kinamore really was. Because in true crime stories, we often hear about the suspects, the violence, the court cases. But behind every headline is a real person whose life meant something. India's story deserves that space. India Kinamore was just 26 years old. She grew up in Ohio, surrounded by a family that loved her deeply. Friends described her as warm, genuine, and full of energy. She wasn't someone who craved the spotlight. She was grounded, the type of person who made people feel at ease just by being in the room. To her mother, Terry, India was more than a daughter. She was her confidant, her best friend, and soon to be the one to make her a grandmother. In early 2023, India was counting down the days to motherhood. She was pregnant with a baby boy, and everything in her world revolved around that child. The nursery was prepared, the baby shower had already been celebrated, and the anticipation of a new chapter in life filled the air. Her due date wasn't just circled on the calendar. It was the center of every conversation, every plan. India had dreams that went far beyond that small apartment in Colleran Township. She wanted to build a stable home for her son, to provide him with safety, comfort, and opportunities. Family members would later say she couldn't stop talking about her future as a mom. The excitement in her voice was contagious. When she spoke about the baby, she lit up. She was nervous, sure. Every first-time mom is. But she was ready. Her pregnancy hadn't been without stress, though. The relationship with her partner, Kayvon Warren, was complicated. Those close to her noticed arguments, moments of tension. But like many young women preparing to raise a child, India focused on the positive. She was determined to move forward, to stay strong, and to give her baby a chance at life filled with love. In the weeks leading up to March 4th, India's family and friends surrounded her with support. They checked in often, made sure she had what she needed, and tried to ease her nerves as the due date grew closer. There were late-night phone calls, texts filled with excitement, even plans for who would be the first to hold the baby. Her world revolved around the little kick she felt in her belly and the promise of meeting her son. That's what makes this case so devastating. Because when you understand who India was, this vibrant young woman filled with hope and preparing to bring new life into the world, the crime becomes even more heartbreaking. She wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just another murder victim. She was a mother in waiting, a daughter loved beyond words, a friend cherished by many. When tragedy struck, it wasn't only India's life that was stolen. It was the future she had dreamed about. It was the baby boy who never got to feel his mother's embrace. And it was the countless moments of joy her family will never get back. This is why telling her story matters. Because at the center of every true crime case, there's a human being whose life should have continued. India Kinamore deserved to see her son grow up. She deserved to chase her dreams, to live, to thrive. But instead, everything was stolen in a single violent act. To really understand what happened to India Kinamore, we have to take a closer look at her relationship with the man who would later be accused of orchestrating her murder. Kayvon Warren. Kayvon was 30 years old at the time. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary guy trying to make ends meet. But beneath that surface, things weren't stable. He was dealing with serious financial trouble, debts piling up, bills overdue, even the loss of his home. Friends and investigators would later describe him as a man cornered by life, desperate for a way out. India and Kayvon's relationship had always been complicated. They weren't the picture-perfect couple. There were moments of affection, yes, but also frequent arguments, especially once India became pregnant. For India, this baby was a blessing. For Kayvon, it appears the pregnancy represented something very different. Pressure, responsibility, and a future he wasn't ready or willing to embrace. Those close to India noticed the tension, arguments over money, heated conversations about the baby, and Warren's growing distance. There were reports that he pressured India to consider abortion, but India refused. She wanted her child. She was determined to bring him into the world, no matter the challenges. And that decision seems to have deepened the divide between them. For India, motherhood was hope. For Warren, it looked more like a trap. He was already struggling to keep his life together. The idea of raising a child, of financial obligations, of being tied to India forever, may have felt unbearable to him. Investigators would later reveal something chilling. Warren wasn't just struggling. He was actively looking for a way to escape. Not by leaving the relationship, not by starting over somewhere else, but by erasing the problem altogether. In his eyes, that problem was India and the baby she carried. And this wasn't just speculation. Detectives uncovered evidence that Warren's financial troubles were spiraling out of control. He had lost his home, he was tied up in a new relationship, and he seemed desperate to keep up appearances. Having a baby with India threatened all of that. It's the ultimate betrayal, because instead of standing beside her, Warren allegedly began plotting against her. Think about the contrast here. India was decorating a nursery and buying baby clothes. Meanwhile, the father of her child was, according to prosecutors, laying the groundwork for her murder. The darkest part? Warren's alleged plan wasn't sloppy or spur of the moment. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. At one point, he even filed for bereavement leave from work before India was killed. That single act revealed to prosecutors just how far ahead he had been planning and how certain he was about what was going to happen. From the outside, India and Warren looked like a couple preparing for parenthood. But behind closed doors, the cracks were widening into a dangerous rift. What should have been a shared journey into parenthood was instead a collision course with tragedy. This relationship, the tension, the financial struggles, the conflicting visions of the future, became the backdrop for a crime that would shock an entire community. Because when Warren made his choice, it wasn't just India's life he destroyed, it was the life of their unborn child and the future of two families who would never recover from the loss. March 4th, 2023. For most families, a due date is filled with anticipation. But for India Kinamore, the day that should have been the beginning of her son's life became the end of her own. That morning in Coleraine Township, Ohio, neighbors went about their routines, unaware that inside one modest apartment, a carefully planned nightmare was unfolding. India was at home, heavily pregnant, waiting for the moment she had been preparing for. She should have been surrounded by family, perhaps timing contractions or getting ready for the hospital. Instead, her world was about to collide with unimaginable violence. According to investigators, this was not a random act. Two young men, later identified as Robert Irvin, just 20 years old, and Lamar Morris Suggs, 22, entered her apartment. The intrusion was staged to look like a burglary gone wrong. But India wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was the target. The details of those final moments are difficult to hear. The confrontation escalated quickly. India, vulnerable and 9 months pregnant, had little chance to defend herself. Shots were fired. In an instant, the life of a young mother and her unborn child were extinguished. The sound of gunfire echoed, but within minutes, silence returned, leaving behind a scene that would haunt detectives and family members forever. When police were called to the apartment, what they found was devastating. India's body, lifeless. Her baby boy, who should have been delivered that very day, gone before he could ever take his first breath. There was no joy, no celebration, no birth announcement, only grief. At first glance, the crime scene looked like it might have been a break-in. There were signs of forced entry, but something didn't add up. The apartment wasn't ransacked the way you'd expect in a robbery. Valuables were still in place. It was as if the intruders didn't care about money or possessions. Their mission was singular: end India's life. News of her death spread quickly through the community. For neighbors, it was unthinkable. How could such violence erupt against a young mother on the very day she was supposed to welcome her child? For her family, the shock was indescribable. They had been preparing to meet a baby. Instead, they were confronted with the reality of planning a funeral. In the days that followed, questions multiplied. Who would want to kill a woman about to give birth? Why would anyone target someone like India, who had no enemies and no history of conflict? And how could this have happened inside her own home, a place that should have been safe? What investigators didn't know that day, but would spend the next 2 years uncovering, was that this crime was not random at all. It wasn't a burglary. It wasn't a senseless act of violence by strangers. It was deliberate, planned, and tied directly to the father of India's unborn child. When detectives first stepped into India Kinamore's apartment on March 4th, 2023, they were confronted with a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. On the surface, it looked like a burglary gone wrong, forced entry, signs of intrusion. But the longer they looked, the more the crime scene seemed staged. There was no chaos, no missing valuables, no frantic search through drawers or cabinets. The television was still in place, jewelry hadn't been taken, and personal items were untouched. For experienced investigators, this was a red flag. If it wasn't about money, then what was the motive? From the very beginning, detectives suspected that India's death wasn't random. Someone had come to that apartment with a purpose. But finding out who and why wouldn't be easy. The Colleran Township Police Department, along with Hamilton County prosecutors, began piecing together India's final days. They combed through phone records, text messages, and financial documents. They interviewed family, friends, and neighbors, searching for any clue that might point them in the right direction. But early on, there were no smoking guns, no obvious suspects, and without clear evidence, the case seemed to stall. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. For India's family, the wait was agonizing. Her mother, Terry Kinamore, said she never stopped believing that justice would come. But as time passed, it became harder to hold on to hope. The community mourned quietly, wondering if the truth would ever surface. Behind the scenes, though, detectives weren't giving up. They continued to press forward, revisiting evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the smallest details. One question drove their work. If this wasn't a robbery, then who had the most to gain from India's death? The answers slowly began to emerge from the shadows. As investigators dug deeper, their focus shifted towards someone close, someone who should have been celebrating the birth of India's child, not benefiting from her death. It was the man who shared the responsibility of that pregnancy, Kayvon Warren. At first, Warren didn't stand out. He wasn't at the crime scene, and nothing directly tied him to the shooters. But investigators began noticing troubling inconsistencies. His financial records showed mounting stress. He had recently lost his home. And while India was preparing to raise their baby, Warren was reportedly involved with another woman. What really raised eyebrows was something far more sinister. Documentation showing that Warren had applied for bereavement leave at his job before India was killed. That detail, once uncovered, changed everything. It was no longer just suspicion. It was the first piece of evidence suggesting premeditation. Still, proving it wouldn't be simple. Police needed more. They had to connect Warren not only to motive, but also to action, and that meant uncovering who had physically carried out the crime. By re-examining phone records and tracking communication patterns, detectives eventually identified two young men, Robert Irvin and Lamar Morris Suggs. Their names had surfaced before, but now the pieces fit. These weren't random intruders. They were hired hands brought into the plan by Warren himself. The case was starting to take shape. But until prosecutors could build it brick by brick, Warren remained free, and India's family was left in limbo. The mystery wasn't fully solved yet, but the shadows were beginning to lift. For 2 years, the case of India Kinamore haunted Colleran Township. A young mother-to-be had been murdered on her due date, and the community was left with questions that seemed impossible to answer. But in August of 2025, prosecutors finally revealed what investigators had been piecing together all along, and the truth was even darker than anyone had imagined. At the center of it all was Kayvon Warren, the man who should have been by India's side, ready to welcome their child. Instead, prosecutors say he was the mastermind of her death. The evidence told a story of cold calculation, financial desperation, and betrayal on the deepest level. Detectives traced Warren's steps in the months before the murder. They discovered his growing debts, the foreclosure of his home, and his involvement with another woman. For him, fatherhood wasn't joy, it was a burden. And rather than face responsibility, he allegedly plotted to remove it. But Warren didn't act alone. According to prosecutors, he enlisted two young men, Robert Irvin, 20 years old, and Lamar Morris Suggs, 22. The plan was simple, at least in Warren's mind. Stage a burglary, make it look random, and eliminate both India and the baby. In return, the two accomplices would receive money and protection. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the brutality of the act, but the preparation behind it. Warren had even submitted a request for bereavement leave from his job before the murder took place. Think about that. While India was folding baby clothes and preparing for labor, Warren was preparing his excuse for her death. It was proof of premeditation so chilling that prosecutors called it one of the coldest moves they had ever seen. Phone records linked Warren to Irvin and Suggs. Financial trails suggested he was supporting or directing them, and witness interviews helped confirm what detectives already suspected. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was carefully orchestrated, with roles assigned and a cover story already in place. When the indictments were announced, the community finally learned the truth. Warren was charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder, along with Irvin and Suggs. Each man faced a mountain of charges, 13 in total, including aggravated burglary and felony assault. Prosecutors made it clear, if convicted, they would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. For India's family, the revelation was both devastating and validating. Devastating because it confirmed their worst fears. The man tied to India by love and fatherhood had turned against her. Validating because, after 2 long years of silence, justice was finally moving forward. The press conference announcing the charges was emotional. Prosecutors spoke of India with compassion, reminding the public that she and her unborn child were the true victims here. And they pointed to the mountain of evidence showing this was not random violence, but a deliberate act of betrayal. What made the case stand out wasn't just the brutality, but the heartlessness. To end the life of a woman in her most vulnerable moment, about to bring a child into the world, and to snuff out that child's first breath before it even happened, was something that shook even seasoned investigators. The story that had once seemed like a tragic mystery now had a face, a motive, and a chilling plan behind it. And while the legal battle was just beginning, the truth was finally out. India Kinamore's death had been orchestrated not by strangers, but by the man who should have been celebrating her life. On August 21st, 2025, more than 2 years after the murder, the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office stepped up to the microphones and made the announcement the community had been waiting for. The case of India Kinamore was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was now a formal criminal indictment, with 3 names attached: Kayvon Warren, Robert Irvin, and Lamar Morris Suggs. The charges were staggering. 13 counts in total, including 4 counts of aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and felony assault. Each charge carried the potential for decades behind bars. And for aggravated murder, the maximum penalty in Ohio could mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutor Connie Pillich didn't hold back. She called the case one of the most disturbing she had ever seen. Standing before cameras, she explained how Warren, the father of India's unborn child, had allegedly recruited Irvin and Suggs to stage a fake robbery. The evidence, she said, was overwhelming. From phone records to financial traces to Warren's chilling bereavement leave request filed before the murder, the pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. As she spoke, the weight of her words rippled across the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The public, many of whom had followed the story since 2023, finally had confirmation of what they had long suspected. This wasn't random. It wasn't senseless. It was planned, deliberate, and heartless. The defendants were brought into court one by one. Warren, once seen as the grieving partner, now stood accused of masterminding the killing. His bond was set so high, reports varied between $600,000 and no bail at all, that it was clear the court considered him a danger. Irvin, just 20 years old at the time of the crime, faced similar charges and was also held on steep bail. Suggs was already incarcerated on unrelated charges, and now his future looked even darker. For India's family, the indictments were a bittersweet moment. Her mother, Terry Kinamore, told reporters she never lost faith that justice would come. But standing in front of cameras, her voice cracked as she spoke of her daughter and grandson who would never come home. There was relief that the truth was finally out, but nothing could erase the pain of their absence. The community's reaction was one of outrage and sorrow. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles and flowers to India's apartment in 2023 now stood outside the courthouse, shaking their heads at the betrayal. How could a father plan the death of his own child? How could he look into the eyes of a woman carrying his baby and see only a problem to be eliminated? Local news stations replayed images of India smiling with her pregnant belly, paired with mug shots of the accused. The contrast was jarring, a reminder of everything that had been lost. Social media exploded with condolences, anger, and calls for justice. The story resonated far beyond Ohio, sparking national coverage and renewed debates about domestic violence, financial stress, and the hidden dangers within relationships. For prosecutors, the next step was clear: build the case in court and pursue the maximum penalty. For India's loved ones, the road was less defined. Justice, no matter how thorough, could never bring back what they lost. But at least now, after years of silence, the truth had been dragged into the light. When we look back on the story of India Kinamore, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what was lost. Here was a young woman, just 26 years old, standing on the threshold of motherhood. Her son was due to enter the world that very day. Instead, both lives were cut short in an act so calculated, so heartless, that it left an entire community stunned. This case forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths. The greatest threats don't always come from strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they come from the people closest to us, the ones we expect to protect and support us. India's death was not the result of random violence. It was orchestrated by the man who should have been her partner in raising a child. That betrayal makes the tragedy even more profound. It also highlights how fragile trust can be. On the outside, Warren looked like a partner preparing for fatherhood. But behind the scenes, he was allegedly setting a plan in motion, one that ended with the deaths of both India and their unborn baby. That contrast, the image of a father-to-be versus the reality of a calculated killer, is what makes this story so chilling. For India's family, there will never be true closure. Justice, when it comes, can't replace her laughter at family gatherings. It can't bring back the baby clothes neatly folded in her apartment. It can't erase the silence that fell on March 4th, 2023, where there should have been a newborn's first cry. But knowing that the truth has been uncovered, that those responsible will stand trial, offers at least a small measure of peace. For the community, the lesson is sobering. Domestic violence and control can wear many faces. Financial stress, manipulation, secrecy, they can all build towards something dangerous if left unchecked. India's case is a reminder that red flags, no matter how small, should never be ignored. Lives may depend on it. As we close this story, let's remember India not just as a victim, but as the young woman she truly was, full of hope, love, and excitement for the future. Her story deserves to live on, not only as a cautionary tale, but also as a way to honor her life and the child who never got the chance to breathe. And maybe that's the hardest part of all, because on the day that should have been about beginnings, we were left with nothing but endings. What do you think about this case? Do you believe justice will truly be served? And what lessons should society take from tragedies like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like this, cases that deserve to be told, remembered, and reflected upon, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next episode. This was the story of India Kinamore, murdered on the very day she was supposed to bring life into the world.